Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Monday, February 2nd, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 75.8 degrees, with a low of 45.3 degrees, so expect a pleasant start to the week with mild evenings ahead. Coming up, we'll examine why the reopening of Rafah in Gaza carries more symbolic weight than real progress on the ground, and explore how ongoing Senate gridlock is pushing up premiums for Obamacare plans. Plus, other key stories from around the world and right here at home. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We start this half hour in Gaza, where a crucial border crossing has just partially reopened after nearly 2 years of closure. Our reporter Ethan has been following the details. Ethan, what actually changed at Rafah today?
Today, for the first time in almost 2 years, a limited number of Palestinians were allowed to walk through the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt. According to NPR, which is drawing on Associated Press reporting from Cairo, the gates reopened this morning our time after a small pilot run yesterday. It is strictly for pedestrians right now. No cars, no trucks, no cargo. And even on foot, we are talking about a very small number of people.
How small are we talking? And who is being allowed through first?
Egyptian and Israeli officials told NPR and the BBC that only about 50 Palestinians can cross in each direction on this first day. The priority is medical evacuations out of Gaza and Palestinians who were stranded abroad and are now finally coming home. Al Jazeera reports that Israel's coordinator of government activities in the territories is calling this a, quote, pilot phase, end quote, to test security and logistics. Humanitarian aid, the food and fuel and medicine Gaza desperately needs, is still being routed through Israel's Kerem Shalom crossing, not Rafah.
So if Rafah is this tiny pedestrian funnel right now, how is the process actually being run on the ground?
The layers of security are intense. The BBC says every individual is vetted twice, by both Israeli and Egyptian authorities, and Israel is doing some of its checks remotely from a new screening facility built on the Gaza side. European Union border experts, the EUBAM mission, are on site helping supervise, mirroring a model used briefly last year. Palestinian staff, around 30 of them according to the BBC, showed up on the Egyptian side for yesterday's trial run, and Egyptian state media showed ambulances lined up waiting for patients.
You mentioned this is a pilot under a broader ceasefire plan. Who is actually in charge of this crossing now, especially with Hamas no longer officially running it?
A new technocratic body is at the center of it. The Washington Post reports that operations on the Gaza side are being overseen by the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, or NCAG, a 15-member group led by Dr. Ali Shaf, a former Palestinian Authority deputy minister. This is part of the U.S.-brokered comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict, often called the Trump-Gaza peace plan, which shifted day-to-day administration away from Hamas. But Israeli forces still control the buffer strip along the Philadelphia corridor beside Rafah, saying they want to prevent weapons smuggling so it is nowhere near full Palestinian control.
Let's rewind a bit. Why was Rafah closed for so long in the first place?
It goes back to the broader war. After Hamas's attack on southern Israel on October 7, 2023, which killed around 1,200 Israelis and saw about 251 people taken hostage, Israel launched a massive military campaign in Gaza. In May of 2024, Israeli forces seized the Gaza side of Rafah in an offensive aimed at shutting down tunnels and weapons routes, as the BBC and other outlets have detailed. Until then, Rafah had been Gaza's only non-Israeli land exit, a vital route for civilians and for aid under joint Palestinian-Egyptian management with Israeli coordination. That seizure is what effectively sealed Gaza off to the outside world.
And now this reopening is tied directly to that Trump-Gaza peace plan you mentioned. Where does this fit into the phases of that deal?
The Rafah pilot is a big piece of Phase 2 of the plan. According to the Times of Israel and official White House statements cited across coverage, The United Nations Security Council endorsed this 20-point roadmap in Resolution 2803 last November. Phase 1, which ran from October of last year through January, focused on exchanging hostages and prisoners. All surviving Israeli captives were returned, and about 2,000 Palestinian prisoners were released. Israel also pulled some forces back to what they call a yellow line buffer inside Gaza. Phase 2, which kicked in late last month, is about stabilizing borders and standing up that interim Gaza administration, with Rafah as a key test of whether people can move safely.
We know Israel delayed this reopening. What finally unlocked it now? And what was Egypt insisting on?
Several outlets, including CBS News and the Associated Press, report that Israel made the reopening conditional on recovering the remains of the last missing Israeli soldier, Master Sergeant Ran Gvili. Those remains were located in a northern Gaza cemetery just last week, which satisfied that condition under the ceasefire terms. Egypt, meanwhile, pushed hard to make sure Rafah did not become a one-way exit out of Gaza. The BBC says Cairo insisted on two-way movement so Palestinians can both leave for treatment and return home to avoid anything that looks like permanent mass displacement.
Zooming out to the human scale, how many people are actually trying to move through this crossing in the coming weeks?
The numbers are overwhelming compared to these tight caps. Al Jazeera, quoting Gaza's government media office, says roughly 80,000 Palestinians who fled during the war want to come back through Rafah. On top of that, about 22,000 people who are wounded or seriously ill are waiting for evacuation, and more than 1 in 5 of them are children. The World Health Organization, which the BBC and NPR both cite, is organizing buses from areas still controlled by Hamas to that yellow line inside Gaza, and from there, people are escorted toward Rafah. So you have tens of thousands of people in need, and tens of people getting through each day.
How is Egypt preparing to receive those medical evacuees, given how stretched Gaza's hospitals already are?
Egyptian health officials have been bracing for this for months. NPR reports that Egypt has designated around 150 hospitals across the country to take in Gaza patients, from Sinai up to Cairo and beyond. Their health ministry has publicly said they are ready for arrivals, and you can see that in those lines of ambulances waiting at Rafah on the Egyptian side. But the caseload coming out of Gaza is so severe that even a well-prepared system like Egypt's is going to feel the strain.
When you put those needs next to the current rules, allowing maybe 50 patients a day, what does that gap look like for families on the ground?
It feels like a lifeline and a heartbreak at the same time. Gaza's health officials told NPR they have around 20,000 urgent medical cases alone, not counting people who simply want to rejoin family. Yet the daily quota right now is only 50 patients, each allowed to bring maybe 1 or 2 relatives. The BBC described it as a fragile lifeline, but one that leaves most people still stuck on the wrong side of the fence, watching others leave.
We have heard some of their stories already. Can you share a couple that really illustrate what this reopening means to individuals?
Al Jazeera profiled a 65-year-old cancer patient, Abed El-Halim Abo Askar, who was supposed to have surgery on October 10, 2023, just as the war erupted. That operation never happened. Since then, his daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughters were killed in an early airstrike, and he's been trying to survive without regular medicine in a shattered system. His son told Al Jazeera, quote, "We do not know what to do," end quote, after repeated promises of evacuation fell through. The BBC highlighted another case, 45-year-old Sabrine Aldama, who is desperate to get her teenage daughter Rawa out for kidney treatment, saying she is ready to donate her own kidney abroad but fears bureaucratic delays will come too late.
And what about Palestinians who got out earlier in the war and are now trying to come home through this same crossing?
There is a huge backlog there, too. The BBC, citing Egyptian reports, says more than 30,000 Gazans have registered with the Palestinian embassy in Cairo, hoping to return once Rafah is fully functioning. With only a few dozen people a day allowed back in, many of them feel they are in limbo, wondering if they will be stuck in Egypt or elsewhere indefinitely. Al Jazeera's correspondent in Khan Yunis talked about an uncomfortable mood in Gaza itself, where people who want to leave for medical care or school also worry that if they step out, they may never be allowed to return.
Does any of this change the broader aid picture for Gaza, Or is Rafah mostly about people rather than supplies right now?
It is almost entirely about people, at least for now. The United Nations, quoted by Al Jazeera, says Gaza needs at least 600 truckloads of supplies each day to meet minimum humanitarian needs. Those trucks are still supposed to come through crossings controlled by Israel, like Kerem Shalom, because Rafah's pilot phase bans vehicles and commercial goods. So even as a few dozen people a day escape for treatment or come home, the vast majority of food, fuel, and medicine remains bottlenecked elsewhere.
At the same time, we have this controversy over Doctors Without Borders being barred from Gaza. How does that fit into the humanitarian picture?
It underscores how precarious the medical situation is. Al Jazeera and The Guardian report that Israel is expanding a ban on Doctors Without Borders, known as MSF, starting March 1st because the group would not hand over full staff lists. And this extends a December move that already sidelined 37 aid organizations. A London-based MSF physician, James Smith, called it, quote, systematic weaponization of aid, end quote, pointing to more than 1,700 Palestinian healthcare workers killed and the near collapse of Gaza's hospitals. That makes external medical evacuations through Rafah even more critical, because inside Gaza, the system is barely functioning.
This is all happening under a ceasefire, but the numbers you mentioned earlier suggest violence has not stopped. What is the security situation like as Phase 2 of the plan unfolds?
It is a ceasefire on paper, but it is not peace. Al Jazeera, citing Gaza health officials, says Israeli operations have killed at least 511 Palestinians and wounded about 1,405 people since October of last year, when the ceasefire formally began. Some of those deaths come from enforcing that yellow line buffer, where civilians risk being shot if they wander into restricted areas, others from drone strikes on alleged Hamas targets, and from unexploded ordnance. The BBC and NPR both mention recent strikes, including one yesterday that killed a 63-year-old man near Rafah, and raids on Saturday that left 31 people dead across Gaza.
How are the new Gaza administrators reacting to that reality, especially someone like Ali Shaath, who is meant to implement this plan?
With a lot of frustration, the Washington Post quotes Shaath describing the current situation as a, quote, hollow peace, end quote, because there is no robust protection for civilians, even though big diplomatic milestones are being celebrated. His committee, the NCAG, is supposed to manage crossings like Rafah and help demilitarize Gaza, but they are doing it under the shadow of continuing Israeli military control along the borders. That tension makes it harder to convince ordinary Palestinians that this process is really about their safety and rights.
Part of that protection is supposed to come from an international force, right? Has that actually materialized yet?
Only partially and very slowly. The ceasefire deal and that United Nations resolution envision an international stabilization force to monitor demilitarization and keep armed groups like Hamas from rearming. The Times of Israel and others report that deployment has lagged, with small advance teams but no full-scale presence on the ground. Until that force is really visible at places like Rafah and along the Yellow Line, enforcement will largely remain in Israeli hands, which many Palestinians and some international observers see as a conflict of interest.
Looking further ahead, there is talk of massive reconstruction and economic projects in Gaza. What does that future vision look like on paper?
On paper, it is extremely ambitious and very controversial. The Washington Post obtained documents about something called the Great Trust, which stands for Gaza Reconstitution, Economic Acceleration, and Transformation, backed by public-private partnerships. The plans include projects nicknamed the MBS Ring Highway, an Elon Musk smart manufacturing zone, and Gaza Riviera resort developments along the coast. Supporters say it could finally transform Gaza's shattered economy, but critics warn it risks entrenching displacement, especially with a proposed $5,000 so-called voluntary relocation bonus that many Palestinians fear could become pressure to leave.
How have other countries responded to today's Rafah move, given those bigger questions about displacement and reconstruction?
European governments are trying to strike a balance. NPR notes that the European Union and the United Kingdom welcomed the reopening, calling it an important first step and urging that the numbers be scaled up quickly. The United Nations has stressed that this must not become a fig leaf, saying that real progress means far more people and goods moving safely. Egypt's role is central here. The BBC points out that Egyptian negotiators insisted on the right of return through Rafah, but there are still deep concerns among Palestinians that, as long as Israel controls the surrounding corridor, any expansion could be reversed or manipulated.
So, Ethan, as this pilot gets underway, what are officials saying about what happens next at Rafah if things go smoothly or if they do not?
According to NPR's sources, the idea is to review these first days carefully and then start increasing the daily quotas if there are no major security incidents. You could see more patients, more students, and eventually some business travelers allowed to cross, still on foot. But everyone also understands that a single attack or a serious security scare could shut the crossing again, as we saw during a brief pause in early 2025 that The Guardian reminded readers about. In that sense, Rafah is both a pressure valve and a barometer of whether the ceasefire is actually holding.
With all that in mind, what does this moment at Rafah really tell us about the gap between the peace plan on paper and life in Gaza today?
It shows how far there is still to go. On one hand, as the BBC and the Washington Post both stress, having any movement at Gaza's only non-Israeli land gateway is a real shift after almost 2 years of total closure. On the other hand, the limits are stark. Dozens of people get out while tens of thousands wait. The ceasefire is in place while hundreds have been killed since it began. Big reconstruction schemes are drafted while many families still sleep in rubble. Rafah's reopening today is a symbol of what might be possible, but also a reminder that until the pace of change matches the scale of suffering, this plan will feel more like a diplomatic document than a lived reality.
A complicated and emotional picture, to say the least. Ethan, thanks for walking us through it this morning.
Thank you, Grace.
This morning, we're looking at a healthcare shock hitting millions of Americans right now. Reporter Chloe Bennett's been digging into why Obamacare premiums are suddenly soaring. Chloe, what's going on?
As of today, those Enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies that kept marketplace plans relatively affordable have expired. According to Kaiser Family Foundation and federal data, roughly 23 million people using healthcare.gov or state exchanges are seeing premiums jump more than 100% on average. Families who were paying around $400 a month are suddenly looking at bills close to, or even above, $2,000. And the Senate, where an extension is stuck, has essentially frozen in place.
So these subsidies didn't come out of nowhere. Can you remind us what they were and how we got here?
They were first pumped up during the COVID pandemic in 2021 under the American Rescue Plan. That law, and later the Inflation Reduction Act, boosted tax credits and removed what people called the subsidy cliff, so middle-class families did not get walloped when they earned just a bit more. According to NPR's health coverage, that setup helped push enrollment to record highs because people finally saw prices they could manage. But Congress always wrote those boosts as temporary, and they ended on December 31st of last year.
Lawmakers knew that date was coming for years. Why did they let it lapse and trigger this kind of sticker shock?
Negotiations fell apart mostly in the Senate, even though there was a brief flicker of bipartisanship in the House. In early January, the House actually passed a 3-year extension using a rare discharge petition, meaning a small group of Republicans joined Democrats to force a vote over their own leadership's objections. That bill would have kept premiums capped at about 8.5% of income for many families and preserved the no-cliff structure up to 400% of the federal poverty level. But once it crossed the Capitol, Senate talks sputtered and then collapsed.
Who are the key players in that Senate fight, and what went wrong there?
On the Republican side, Senator Bernie Moreno of Ohio and Senator Susan Collins of Maine helped lead a bipartisan working group. On the Democratic side, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer pushed for what he called a clean 3-year extension, with no major changes attached. NPR's Selena Simmons-Duffin reported today that after some early optimism, those talks sputtered by late January, with both sides digging in. Republicans refused to back the House bill without new cost controls, while Democrats rejected the GOP conditions as, in their words, poison pills.
Moreno's become a central figure in this. How is he justifying holding out when his own state is getting hit?
Senator Moreno argues that the Affordable Care Act itself is the problem, not just the missing subsidies. In one interview NPR archived, he called the law, quote, an abject failure, end quote, saying it never really brought down underlying health costs. But Kaiser Foundation data show the hardest hits right now are actually in red, rural states like his, where people often lack employer coverage. In Ohio alone, experts estimate enrollment drops approaching 20%, meaning perhaps 110,000 to 140,000 people stepping away from coverage.
You mentioned Republicans wanted changes attached. What exactly are they trying to swap in for a straightforward extension?
They put forward something called the Consumer Affordability and Responsibility Enhancement Act, or the CARE Act, last December. According to Senate records and analyses by health law firms, it would extend the subsidies only for 2 years, and it tightens who qualifies. Households above roughly $200,000 in income would be cut off, zero premium plans would disappear, and everyone would have to pay at least a small monthly amount, maybe $5 to $25. It also expands health savings accounts and forces more transparency from pharmacy benefit managers in hopes of chipping away at drug prices.
And why are Democrats so opposed to that CARE Act approach?
Democrats say it shifts the burden onto lower-income people who are already struggling. Their argument, laid out by Schumer and echoed in reporting from outlets like WTTW, is that even a small mandatory premium can push very low-income families out of the market. They also worry that expanding HSAs mainly helps higher earners with the tax benefits while cutting the most direct premium relief. So when Republicans pitched the CARE Act as their best and final offer in late January, Democrats balked and tried instead to pass their clean 3-year extension by unanimous consent, which Republicans then blocked.
So both sides had votes, and yet nothing passed. How close did they actually get to a deal?
Not very, once you factor in the Senate's filibuster rules. In December, each party put forward its own bill, and both pulled in about 51 votes, according to QuiverQuant and other trackers cited by public television outlets. That sounds like a majority, but under current Senate rules, they needed 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. When neither side would budge, negotiations slipped down the priority list, especially as lawmakers turned to a separate fight over Homeland Security funding and a possible partial government shutdown.
Let's talk real-world fallout. What are families seeing in their inboxes and at enrollment websites right now?
The open enrollment period for 2026 plans wrapped up in mid-January, and the shock was immediate. Federal data cited by CBS News show about 23 million signups, down from roughly 24.2 million the year before. Average annual premiums for subsidized enrollees have jumped from around $888 to about $1,904, more than double. Kaiser's surveys suggest about a quarter of current marketplace customers are seriously considering dropping their plans altogether.
That raises the big question: how many people could end up uninsured if this drags on?
The Congressional Budget Office estimates that losing these enhanced subsidies alone could push about 4 million people into the ranks of the uninsured this year. When you layer in cuts that started this year under a separate Republican law, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, CBO projects as many as 15 million more uninsured over time. That would erase roughly 2/3 of the coverage gains since the Affordable Care Act took effect in 2010. Health policy scholar Jonathan Oberlander told NPR this amounts to a, quote, de facto rollback, end quote, without an outright repeal vote.
Politically, that sounds risky for Republicans, especially in Trump-leaning states that rely heavily on these subsidies. How are experts reading that?
Oberlander and others say it looks like a replay of 2018 when voters punished Republicans for repeal attempts. The twist this time, according to NPR's analysis, is that Republicans are leaning on a time-worn strategy of attacking Obamacare's architecture rather than frontally repealing it, hoping that lowers the backlash. But polls in states like Ohio and Louisiana, where Senator Bill Cassidy has been a key Republican voice on healthcare, show residents overwhelmingly care more about premium relief than structural tweaks. That gap could become a major midterm election issue later this year.
You mentioned public opinion. What do we know about how Americans are viewing this lapse in subsidies?
Kaiser's January tracking poll of about 1,400 adults found 67% think Congress did the wrong thing by letting the subsidies expire. That concern actually outranked worries about groceries or utility bills, which is striking in an era of high prices. Support for extending the help cuts across party lines more than you might expect. Nearly 90% of Democrats, over 70% of independents, and a significant minority of Republicans want the subsidies back. And separate polling reported by outlets like the Las Vegas Sun shows more than 70% of Republican Affordable Care Act enrollees personally favor an extension, even if they identify as MAGA or conservative.
That's the national picture. Are any states trying to shield their residents from these premium spikes on their own?
Yes, a small group of mostly blue states have scrambled to plug the gap with state dollars. New Mexico, for instance, is using its healthcare affordability fund to fully replace the lost federal subsidies for about 6 months through June, according to state documents and Kaiser's reporting. That program caps premiums as a share of income and even includes some low-income immigrants, and is producing what officials say is a 17% enrollment bump rather than a drop. Maryland, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Colorado, and California have all launched different versions of state-funded assistance, each with its own quirks and limits.
Give us a couple of quick examples of how those state programs actually change what people pay.
Take Maryland. It uses an assessment on health providers to offer full replacement subsidies for people under 200% of the poverty line and partial help for those up to about 400%. State reports summarized by healthinsurance.org show that in places like Baltimore, that has held premium increases to roughly $250 a month for many families, instead of the eye-popping jumps seen elsewhere. In Massachusetts, the Connector Care program was boosted with about $250 million state dollars, totaling around $600 million overall, and now stretches to people up to 500% of the poverty line. That move has kept premiums essentially stable for about 270,000 residents this year.
And on the flip side, what does it look like in states that haven't stepped in with their own money?
In most non-backfill states, people are coping by buying down into cheaper bronze plans that come with much higher deductibles. Kaiser's February analysis, highlighted by Money Talks News, shows a national enrollment drop of about 3.5%, and cancellations running roughly 4 times higher in some states like Idaho, Pennsylvania, and Texas. Many of those customers are ending up with zero premium plans only by accepting thousands of dollars in potential out-of-pocket costs if they actually get sick. Experts at Georgetown's Center on Health Insurance Reforms warn that might look like coverage on paper but offers far less real financial protection.
How sustainable are those state fixes if Washington stays stuck? Can they keep doing this year after year?
Most experts are skeptical. States like New Mexico and Connecticut are very clear in their own budget documents that these are one-year or half-year patches, not permanent commitments. They rely on specific revenue sources, like provider fees or limited trust funds, that can't easily absorb federal-level responsibilities forever. Georgetown researchers say unless Congress acts, even the most generous state programs will face painful choices about raising new taxes, cutting other services, or letting premiums spike again.
There's also that March 1st federal funding deadline coming up. Could this end up folded into a broader spending deal?
That is where pressure is building. According to Capitol Hill coverage from CBS News and Senate.gov trackers, some moderates in both parties are floating the idea of stapling a 2 or 3 year subsidy extension to whatever spending package keeps the government open next month. But the same ideological disputes over cost controls, HSAs, and minimum premiums remain unresolved. If leadership treats this as just another bargaining chip, we could see another short-term patch instead of the longer fix that insurers and families say they need.
How does all this fit into the bigger political story heading into the 2026 midterms?
Analysts like Oberlander predict what he calls payback, meaning voters angry over lost coverage could swing races, especially in states with high marketplace reliance that lean Republican in presidential years. Democrats are already framing the premium spikes as a, quote, Republican tax hike, end quote, on middle-class families. Republicans, for their part, argue the Affordable Care Act structure is unsalvageable without major reforms like those in the CARE Act, and they hope voters will blame Democrats for blocking those. NPR points out that this returns us to long-running grievances about the law's passage in 2010, with very real human stakes attached right now.
Speaking of those human stakes, what are you hearing from people directly affected by these premium jumps?
Marketplace directors and navigators tell NPR and other outlets that the phones have been ringing non-stop with anxious callers. In Maine, for example, Hillary Schneider, who runs the CoverMe marketplace, said it will be, quote, twice as hard, end quote, to bring people back if they drop coverage now and subsidies return later. There are stories of couples talking about marrying just to get on one spouse's employer plan, and of older workers delaying retirement because marketplace coverage suddenly looks unaffordable. Researchers like Miranda Yaver at the University of Pittsburgh say that level of stress, layered on top of an uneven economy, can spill over into everything from mental health to job decisions.
With all that in mind, what's the bottom line for listeners trying to understand where this is headed?
We're in a moment where a program that quietly insured tens of millions for more than a decade is being reshaped not by a single repeal vote, but by inaction and stalemate. If the Senate cannot bridge its divides in the next few weeks, more people are likely to drop coverage, and some of the damage to these insurance markets could be hard to reverse. At the same time, public opinion is clearly running ahead of politicians, with strong majorities wanting Congress to restore the help, regardless of party. Whether lawmakers respond to that pressure before November may decide not only who controls Congress, but how many of their own constituents can afford to see a doctor.
A complicated story with very real consequences for household budgets and health. Chloe Bennett, thanks for walking us through it.
Thank you, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. Tensions between the United States and Iran are nearing a boiling point, with Washington turning up the military heat and Tehran warning that any strike could cook up a regional war. After President Trump issued an ultimatum demanding a tougher nuclear deal and an end to Iran's bloody crackdown on protesters, Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian has quietly turned the negotiation dial from off to simmer, authorizing limited talks to avoid immediate conflict. Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt are trying to stir diplomacy rather than warfare, working to convene a high-level meeting in Ankara between U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. The European Union has already turned up its own pressure, branding Iran's Revolutionary Guard a terrorist group. Tehran fired back by slapping the terrorist label on every EU army. Beyond the war of words, the worry is wallets. A clash that chokes the Strait of Hormuz could send oil prices rocketing past $120 a barrel and test whether U.S. partners are allies in arms or arm's-length allies. A new Government Accountability Office report says the Education Department flunked Fiscal Responsibility 101, spending an estimated $28.50 to $38 million paying employees not to work. About 247 staffers in the Office for Civil Rights were benched on paid administrative leave for nearly 9 months after a plan to fire more than half the office was blocked in court. Rather than grade papers, they collected paychecks, as Education Secretary Linda McMahon barred them from doing any duties. Critics say sidelining civil rights attorneys left discrimination complaints gathering dust while taxpayers picked up the tab. GAO is urging a full audit of the failed reduction in force, but department officials insist the issue is yesterday's homework, now that the staff has been brought back on the job. The Justice Department has opened the files, but not the floodgates in the Jeffrey Epstein saga, releasing roughly 3.5 million pages of records, 2,000 videos, and 180,000 images under the new Epstein Files Transparency Act. The document dump drops big names, among them former Prince Andrew, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and Donald Trump. though officials stress that being mentioned is not the same as being indicted. The political aftershocks have been swift. UK figure Peter Mandelson has resigned, as has a top Slovak official, both over revelations of past ties to the late financier. Lawmakers, however, say transparency is only half-baked, blasting the DOJ for holding back another 2.5 million pages and preparing to grill Attorney General Pamela Bondi at a February 11th hearing over what was redacted, what was withheld, and whether justice is truly being served or merely lightly edited. In Ethiopia, the hidden conflict in the Oromia region is casting a dark and deadly shadow. The Oromo Liberation Army and federal forces are trading more than fire. Rights groups accuse both sides of summary executions, torture, abductions, and rape, turning villages into crime scenes. OLA leader Jal Maro denies targeting civilians, but investigators from the United Nations and Amnesty International say abuses are widespread and escalating, with a full amnesty report due in March. As fresh clashes flare in Amhara and Tigray as well, analysts warn that Ethiopia's fragile peace may be cracking, risking a wider humanitarian catastrophe and pushing millions more from their homes. For Africa's second most populous country, the question is whether the center can hold, or whether the periphery will pull the nation apart. And on Wall Street's favorite river, Amazon is delivering pink slips instead of packages. The company has now confirmed 16,000 corporate layoffs as of February 2nd, bringing total cuts to more than 30,000 since October in an aggressive pivot toward artificial intelligence. Senior Vice President Beth Galetti says the goal is to chop layers and bureaucracy, but leaked documents hint at a longer-term ambition to automate roughly 3/4 of operations, turning headcount into code and raising fears that workers are being replaced by bytes and goodbyes. Economists and ex-employees accuse the company of redundancy washing, using AI as a high-tech high-gloss to justify job cuts and juice the stock price. Regulators aren't just clicking accept. The European Commission has opened a formal probe into Amazon Web Services' AI dominance, while U.S. lawmakers are examining how generative tools could turn white-collar careers into disappearing ink. With 350,000 corporate workers watching, the future of tech employment may depend on whether governments can code new labor protections as quickly as companies can code them out of a job. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.